1:47 a.m. on a freezing Arizona highway. Matthew Walker sees something in his headlights that stops his heart cold. A tiny figure stumbling through the darkness. 7-year-old Sophie, barefoot and bleeding, wearing only a nightgown. "I'm looking for my mommy," she whispers. But her mommy deliberately abandoned her on this deadly stretch of road. What Matthew doesn't know is that saving this broken little girl will heal his own shattered heart. And 8 months later, Sophie will whisper 4 words in his ear that will destroy him completely, in the most beautiful way possible. Words that reveal the true power of a father's love. This is the moment that broke him. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The headlights cut through the blackness like knives. Matthew Walker's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as his exhausted eyes tried to focus on the road ahead. Highway 87 stretched endlessly before him, empty and desolate at this ungodly hour. Then he saw it. At first, his tired brain processed it as debris, maybe a trash bag caught in the wind. But something about the movement made his foot instinctively ease off the gas pedal. As his pickup truck drew closer, the shape became clearer, more defined, more human. Matthew's heart slammed against his ribs. There, stumbling along the shoulder of the highway like a ghost, was a child. A little girl, no bigger than a shadow, wearing what looked like a white nightgown that billowed around her tiny frame. "What the—" Matthew breathed, hitting the brakes and pulling over so fast his tires skidded on the gravel.
The little girl turned at the sound, her face caught in the harsh glare of his headlights. Even from this distance, Matthew could see she was shivering violently. Her feet were bare. Dark stains covered the white fabric of her nightgown. Blood. Matthew threw the truck into park and grabbed the emergency blanket from his glove compartment, something he'd kept there ever since Grace was born, one of those paranoid dad preparations that his wife used to tease him about. His wife. The memory hit him like it always did, sharp and sudden, but he pushed it away. This wasn't about him. The cold desert air bit into his skin as he stepped out of the truck, moving slowly, carefully. The last thing he wanted was to frighten this child more than she already was. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out, his voice gentle but carrying in the stillness. It was the same tone he used when Grace woke up from nightmares, soft and reassuring. "My name is Matthew. I'm a dad just like someone's dad to you. Are you okay?" The little girl stopped walking, but didn't run. She stood there, swaying slightly, her small silhouette framed against the darkness beyond. As Matthew got closer, the details became heartbreakingly clear. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dark hair was tangled and dirty, hanging in matted strands around a face that was streaked with tears and grime. Her feet, sweet heavens, her feet were cut and bleeding from walking on the rough asphalt. The nightgown, once white, was now stained with dirt and blood. But it was her eyes that nearly broke him. They held a weariness that no child should ever carry, an emptiness that spoke of abandonment so deep it had carved itself into her very soul.
"I'm looking for my mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Matthew's chest tightened. He knelt down on the gravel, making himself smaller, less threatening. The emergency blanket was soft in his hands as he held it out to her. "What's your name, honey?" She took a hesitant step forward. "Sophie." "Sophie, that's a beautiful name." Matthew's voice was steady, but inside his heart was racing. How long had she been walking? Where had she come from? The nearest town was 15 miles in either direction. "Sophie, my daughter's name is Grace. She's 6 years old. Do you know how old you are?" 7. Sophie moved closer, close enough that Matthew could see her lips were blue from the cold. "Can you help me find my mommy?" "Of course, sweetheart. Let's get you warm first, okay?"
Sophie allowed him to wrap the blanket around her tiny shoulders, and Matthew felt the violent trembling that shook her entire body. She was hypothermic. In the desert, temperatures could drop dramatically at night, and she was dressed for sleeping, not survival. As Matthew guided her toward his truck, careful not to touch her injured feet, his mind was already working. He'd been a father long enough to know that children didn't end up alone on highways by accident. This wasn't a case of wandering off from a campsite or getting lost during a family trip. This was abandonment, and the thought made him sick. Inside the truck's warm cab, Sophie huddled in the blanket while Matthew grabbed his first aid kit from behind the seat. Grace had taught him to be prepared for everything: scraped knees, splinters, bee stings. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined. "Sophie, I need to call for help, okay? Some nice people who can take care of your feet and help us find your mommy." As he dialed 911, Sophie's small voice stopped him. "She's not coming back." Matthew paused, his finger hovering over the call button. "What do you mean, honey?" Sophie's eyes were focused on her bandaged hands, picking at the edge of the blanket. "She said she'd be right back. She said to wait by the car, but the car is gone, and I walked and walked, but I can't find her." "When did your mommy leave, Sophie?" "Yesterday morning, I think, or maybe before. I was sleeping in the car, and when I woke up, she was gone." The words hit Matthew like a physical blow. Yesterday morning. This child had been alone for over 24 hours, possibly longer. In his mind, he could see his own Grace, safe in her princess bed, never having to question whether her parent would be there when she woke up. He made the call. While they waited for the police and ambulance, Matthew worked on Sophie's feet with a gentleness he had perfected through years of caring for Grace. Each cut he cleaned, each bandage he applied, was done with the same tender precision he used when his daughter needed tending. "My daddy used to do that," Sophie said quietly, watching him work. Matthew's hands stilled for a moment. "Used to?" "Before he went to heaven, Mommy said we didn't have a home anymore after Daddy died. We lived in the car. She said she was going to get help, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Matthew felt something crack open inside his chest. 3 years ago, when he'd lost his wife in that senseless accident, he'd thought he understood tragedy. He'd thought he knew what it meant to have your world shattered in an instant. But sitting here with this abandoned child, he realized there were depths of pain he couldn't even imagine. The flashing lights appeared on the horizon before the sirens reached them. Red and blue strobed across the desert landscape as the police cruiser pulled up behind Matthew's truck, followed closely by an ambulance. Officer Coleman was the first to approach. He was older, probably a father himself, and his expression grew grim as he took in the scene. "You probably saved her life," he told Matthew quietly as the paramedics examined Sophie. "Temperature dropped to near freezing last night. A child that small, dressed like that, another hour or two out here." He didn't finish the sentence. Matthew watched as they prepared to take Sophie to the hospital. Every instinct he possessed as a father screamed against letting her go alone into another unfamiliar situation with more strangers. "Can I follow?" The words came out before he'd even fully formed the thought. I have a daughter her age. I want to make sure she's okay." Officer Coleman studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Actually, we'd appreciate it. She seems to trust you, and that's rare for kids who've been through what she has." As they loaded Sophie into the ambulance, she looked back at Matthew with those wise, wounded eyes. "You're coming too, right?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that nearly undid him. "Right behind you, sweetheart." Matthew called Mrs. Hernandez from his truck as he followed the ambulance toward the city lights. His elderly neighbor had been a lifeline since his wife died, stepping in to help with Grace whenever his work schedule demanded it. "Mijo, what's wrong?" Her voice was immediately alert despite the hour. "I found a little girl on the highway. She's been abandoned. I'm following her to the hospital." "Dios mío. What terrible." "You did the right thing, Matthew. Grace is sleeping peacefully. Take as long as you need." The hospital was a blur of bright lights and antiseptic smells. Matthew sat in the waiting room, his work clothes still carrying the scent of warehouse dust and motor oil, feeling completely out of place among the medical professionals bustling around him. He should go home. He should check on Grace, get some sleep, get ready for another day. But every time he stood to leave, he thought about Sophie's small hand in his, about the way she'd looked at him when she asked if he was coming too. No child should have to face this alone.
2 hours later, a social worker named Ms. Brennan approached him. She was younger than he'd expected, with kind eyes that probably seen too much. "Mr. Walker, Sophie's been asking for you. Would you mind sitting with her for a bit? She's very frightened, and you seem to be the only person she trusts right now." Matthew followed her down a hallway lined with motivational posters and sanitizer dispensers. The pediatric ward was quieter than the rest of the hospital, painted in cheerful colors that seemed almost aggressive in their forced optimism. Sophie looked impossibly small in the hospital bed. They'd cleaned her up, bandaged her feet, started an IV to help with dehydration. But even clean and cared for, she looked fragile, like a bird with broken wings. "Mr. Matthew," her face lit up when she saw him, the first genuine smile he'd witnessed from her. "I thought you left." "No, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure you were okay." He pulled the uncomfortable hospital chair closer to her bed and sat down. Sophie immediately reached out her small hand, and Matthew took it, startled by how cold her fingers still were despite the warm blankets piled around her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the beeping of monitors and the distant chatter of nurses in the hallway. Matthew found himself thinking about Grace, probably dreaming safely at home, and felt a fierce protectiveness toward this child who had no one. "The lady said they can't find my mommy?" Sophie said suddenly. Matthew's throat tightened. Ms. Brennan had pulled him aside earlier to explain what they had discovered. An abandoned car, 15 miles from where he'd found Sophie, clearly lived in, with children's clothes and empty food containers scattered inside, but no sign of the mother.
"They're still looking," he said carefully. Sophie turned to look at him directly, and there was an adult understanding in her 7-year-old eyes that chilled him. "She's not coming back. She said she loved me, but she couldn't do it anymore. She said someone would find me and take care of me better than she could." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Matthew felt tears burning behind his eyes. This child, this baby, had been deliberately abandoned by the one person who was supposed to protect her above all else. In his mind, unbidden, came the memory of his own loss. The phone call at 2:23 a.m. 3 years ago. The drunk driver who'd run the red light. The way Grace had asked for weeks afterward when Mommy was coming home. How he'd had to explain that sometimes people went to heaven and couldn't come back. But this was different. This was a choice. Someone had chosen to leave their child on a dark highway and drive away. "Sophie," he said softly, "I want you to know that what happened to you, it's not your fault. And it's not because you weren't good enough or didn't deserve love. Sometimes adults make terrible choices and kids get hurt. And it's never, ever the child's fault." Sophie studied his face with those old eyes. "Do you have kids?" "I do. A daughter named Grace. She's 6, just like I told you." "Where's her mommy?" Matthew felt the familiar ache, the one that never quite went away. "Her mommy died in a car accident. It's just been Grace and me since then." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. "So you know about missing mommies, too?" "Yes, sweetheart, I do." Over the next 3 days, Matthew found himself returning to the hospital every evening after work. He'd bring small gifts, coloring books, crayons, puzzles from the hospital gift shop, the same things that made Grace smile. Sophie was staying in the children's ward while Child Protective Services worked to locate family members or arrange temporary foster care. She'd been through medical evaluations, psychological assessments, interviews with social workers, but somehow the one constant she asked for was Matthew. "Why do you keep coming back?" she asked him on the 3rd evening as he helped her work on a 1,000-piece puzzle featuring cartoon princesses. Matthew paused, a puzzle piece halfway to its destination. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself. "I guess because when I was your age, if something scary happened to me, I would have wanted someone to stick around, to make sure I was okay. But you don't even know me. Sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes you just know when someone needs help." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, concentrating on finding the piece that would complete Princess Belle's yellow dress. "When I was walking on the road, lots of cars drove by. Their lights would shine on me, but they just kept going." Matthew felt something sharp twist in his stomach. "How many cars?" "I don't know. A lot. But you stopped." "Of course I stopped." "Why?" It was such a simple question, but it hit him with unexpected force. Why had he stopped when others hadn't? He thought about that moment, how he'd been driving on autopilot, exhausted from his double shift, focused only on getting home to Grace. Because, he said slowly, I'm a dad, and every kid is someone's kid, even when they're all alone. Sophie looked up from the puzzle. Even me? Especially you. On the fourth day, Matthew brought Grace with him to the hospital. He'd explained the situation in terms a 6-year-old could understand, that he'd found a little girl who needed friends, who was in the hospital because she'd been hurt and scared. Grace had listened with the serious expression she wore when processing important information, then marched to her toy box and selected 3 of her most prized possessions: a stuffed unicorn, a set of princess stickers, and a picture book about a brave little mouse. For the girl, so she won't be scared.
The meeting between Grace and Sophie was magical in the way that only childhood friendships could be. Within minutes, they were giggling over Grace's sticker collection, comparing favorite colors, and debating whether unicorns or dragons were better. Matthew watched from his chair in the corner, marveling at his daughter's natural compassion. Grace had inherited her mother's kind heart, the part of her wife that had drawn him to her in the first place. Sarah would have loved this moment. "Daddy," Grace said, as they were preparing to leave, tugging on his sleeve to get his attention, "Sophie doesn't have a daddy or a mommy. That's not fair." "No, baby, it's not fair." Grace looked back at Sophie, who was clutching the stuffed unicorn like a lifeline. "Can she come live with us? We have the extra room, the one you said might be for a baby brother or sister someday." The question hit Matthew like a physical blow. The spare room, Sarah's old office, which he'd converted into a guest room, but always imagined might someday be a nursery again. He'd never spoken about it directly with Grace, but somehow she'd picked up on his unspoken hopes. "It's not that simple, sweetheart," he said carefully. But as they drove home, Grace chattering about how much fun it would be to have a sister, Matthew couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face when they'd said goodbye. The way her expression had shuddered, like she was already preparing herself for another abandonment. That evening, after Grace was asleep, Matthew found himself staring at the spare room. It was neat and tidy, decorated in neutral colors, ready for guests who rarely came. But now he could picture it differently. Painted in soft pastels, maybe with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling like Grace had in her room. He could see a second twin bed, another bookshelf filled with stories about brave princesses and magical adventures. He could see Sophie, safe and loved and home. The thought terrified him. Matthew poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd eaten countless meals with Sarah, where he now helped Grace with homework every night. He thought about that night 3 years ago when his world had ended, how he'd nearly drowned in grief until Grace's needs had forced him to keep functioning. He'd rebuilt their life piece by piece. Work, daycare, bedtime stories, weekend trips to the park. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was good. It was stable. It was safe. Bringing Sophie into their world would change everything. There would be trauma to deal with, therapy appointments, legal complications. There would be sleepless nights and difficult conversations, and the very real possibility that Sophie might never fully trust again.
But then he remembered her small hand in his, the way she'd asked if he was coming too, the relief on her face when she saw him return each day. What kind of man would he be if he walked away now? Matthew picked up his phone and dialed the number Miss Brennan had given him. "Miss Brennan? It's Matthew Walker. I know it's late, but I've been thinking. What happens to Sophie now?" There was a pause. "Mr. Walker, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Is everything all right?" "What happens to her?" he repeated. "Foster care, most likely. We're still searching for her mother, but it's been 4 days now. We did locate some relatives, an aunt in Maine, but they said they couldn't take her. Apparently Sophie's mother had burned some bridges, cut ties with the family." Matthew closed his eyes. What if someone wanted to help? To foster her, I mean. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Matthew wondered if the call had dropped. Mr. Walker, Miss Brennan said finally, that's incredibly generous. But you need to understand what you're considering. Sophie has been through severe trauma. She'll need therapy, stability, patience. And you're already a single parent. I know what it's like to have your world destroyed. My wife died 3 years ago. Grace and I, we've rebuilt our life. There's room in it. There's love to spare. Another pause. The process isn't simple. There would be background checks, home visits, foster care training, and that's just to become a temporary placement. If you're thinking about something more permanent, I am, Matthew said, surprising himself with how certain he sounded. I want to adopt her. The words hung in the air, and Matthew felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just about saving Sophie anymore. It was about something Grace had said, about fairness, about the extra room that had been waiting for purpose. Mr. Walker, I have to ask, why? You barely know this child. Matthew thought about the question, really thought about it. Why was he willing to turn his entire life upside down for a little girl he'd met 4 days ago? Because, he said finally, when I found her on that highway, I didn't see a stranger's child. I saw Grace. I saw what could happen to any little girl whose world falls apart. And I couldn't drive away from that.
The process was every bit as complicated as Ms. Brennan had warned. There were forms to fill out, interviews to attend, classes to complete. Matthew had to take time off work for home visits, had to explain to Grace what fostering meant, had to prepare their home for a traumatized child. But through it all, he kept visiting Sophie, who had been placed in a temporary foster home across town. The foster family was kind, but overwhelmed. They were already caring for 3 other children, and Sophie was struggling with nightmares, panic attacks, and a deep-seated fear of being left alone. "She asks for you every day," her temporary foster mother, Mrs. Patterson, told Matthew during one of his visits. "She keeps a picture of you and Grace by her bed. I think she's afraid if she stops asking, you'll stop coming." That night, Matthew made a decision that would have seemed impossible a month ago. He called Ms. Brennan again. "I want to speed up the process. What do I need to do to bring Sophie home?" Home. The word felt right in a way that surprised him. 6 weeks after that night on the highway, Matthew stood in his living room watching Grace show Sophie around their house. Their house. Sophie was still hesitant, still jumping at unexpected sounds, but there was a tentative hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "This is your room," Grace announced, throwing open the door to the former guest room. Matthew had spent the weekend painting it a soft lavender, adding the glow-in-the-dark stars Sophie had mentioned loving. There was a twin bed with a princess comforter that matched Grace's, a bookshelf waiting to be filled, and a small desk where she could do homework. Sophie stood in the doorway, not moving, her few belongings clutched in a small garbage bag. "It's really mine?" she whispered. "Really yours, for as long as you want it to be." Sophie took a tentative step inside, then another. She set down her bag and walked to the window, looking out of the backyard where Grace's swing set stood under the old oak tree. "Can I swing?" she asked. "Any time you want," Grace said immediately. "I'll teach you how to go really high."
That first night was rough. Sophie woke up screaming at 2 a.m., calling for her mother, disoriented and terrified. Matthew rushed to her room to find her huddled in the corner, shaking. "It's okay," he said softly, approaching slowly. "You're safe. You're home." "I want my mommy," Sophie sobbed, and the raw pain in her voice broke something inside Matthew. He sat on the floor beside her, not trying to touch her, just being present. "I know, sweetheart. I know you do. Why did she leave me? Was I bad?" "No." Matthew's voice was fierce. "No, Sophie, you were not bad. You were good and brave and deserving of love. What your mommy did, that was about her problems, not about you. You did nothing wrong." It took an hour to calm her down, and another hour after that before she felt safe enough to get back into bed. Matthew sat in the chair beside her bed until she fell asleep, just as he'd done with Grace during her worst nights after Sarah died. This became their routine. Days filled with small victories, Sophie eating breakfast without being coaxed, laughing at one of Grace's silly jokes, asking for help with her shoelaces. Nights filled with challenges, nightmares, panic attacks, and the heartbreaking questions that no 7-year-old should ever have to ask. But slowly, gradually, Sophie began to heal. She started keeping food in her room, a trauma response that Dr. Martinez, her therapist, said was normal. Matthew let her, making sure she always had access to crackers and juice boxes, showing her where the kitchen snacks were kept. "The food isn't going anywhere," he'd tell her gently, "and neither am I." 3 months into the placement, Sophie had her first good night's sleep. She woke up naturally, without nightmares, and came downstairs to find Matthew making pancakes for Grace. "Can I help?" she asked shyly. "Of course you can. Grace, show Sophie how we flip the pancakes." As he watched his daughters work together, because that's what they were now, he realized, his daughters, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. Completeness.
6 months after the foster placement began, Miss Brennan called with news that changed everything. "We found Sophie's mother," she said without preamble. She was arrested in California for drug possession. When the authorities told her about Sophie, she signed away her parental rights. Matthew sank into his kitchen chair, Grace and Sophie's artwork covering the refrigerator behind him. "What does that mean?" "It means Sophie is legally free for adoption, if you're still interested." Matthew looked through the kitchen doorway to where Sophie and Grace were building a blanket fort in the living room, their laughter echoing through the house. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Yes, I'm interested." The adoption process was different from fostering, more permanent, more final. There were more interviews, more paperwork, more home visits, but this time Matthew wasn't nervous. This time he was certain. Sophie had been with them for 8 months when the final court date arrived. November 15th, a crisp fall morning that dawned clear and bright. Matthew's parents had flown in from Florida, Mrs. Hernandez had taken the day off work, and even Officer Coleman had asked to attend. Grace had insisted on wearing her fanciest dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that Sarah had bought her before she died. Sophie wore a new dress Matthew had bought just for the occasion, red, her favorite color, with a full skirt that twirled when she spun. In the courthouse, they sat in the front row of the family courtroom. Sophie was between Matthew and Grace, holding both their hands. She had been unusually quiet all morning, the weight of the day's significance clear in her serious expression. Judge Harrison was a grandmotherly woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She had presided over dozens of adoptions, but there was something special about this one, something that had captured the attention of everyone involved.
"Sophie," Judge Harrison said kindly, "do you understand what's happening today?" Sophie stood up straighter in her chair. "Mr. Matthew wants to be my forever daddy, and Grace wants to be my forever sister." "That's right. And how do you feel about that?" Sophie looked at Matthew, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Happy. Really, really happy." "Mr. Walker," the judge continued, "you're taking on a tremendous responsibility. Are you prepared to be Sophie's father, to love her and care for her for the rest of your life?" Matthew stood, his voice steady and clear. "Yes, Your Honor. More than prepared. Honored." "Grace," Judge Harrison smiled at the 6-year-old, "you're getting a new sister. Are you ready for that?" Grace bounced in her seat. "Yes, I've been ready forever." The courtroom chuckled, and even Sophie smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Arizona," Judge Harrison said, lifting her gavel, "I hereby grant this petition for adoption. Sophie, you are now officially Sophie Walker, daughter of Matthew Walker, sister to Grace Walker. This court declares you a family." The gavel came down with a satisfying thunk, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Matthew's parents were crying, Mrs. Hernandez was cheering, and Grace was jumping up and down. But Matthew only had eyes on Sophie, who was staring at him with wonder. "It's real?" she whispered. "It's real, baby girl. You're my daughter. Forever." Sophie launched herself into his arms, and Matthew caught her, holding her tight as she sobbed against his shoulder. These weren't tears of pain. These were tears of relief, of joy, of a little girl who finally had a place to belong. But then Sophie pulled back slightly, her small hands framing his face. She looked around at the courtroom full of people celebrating their family, then back at Matthew. Her eyes were bright with tears, but her expression was serious. She leaned close to his ear, so close that only he could hear, and whispered 4 words that shattered him completely. "Thank you for saving me, Daddy. Now I can save other kids like me when I grow up, just like you saved me. I want to be a hero like my daddy."
Matthew's composure crumbled. He sobbed harder than he had since the night he'd lost Sarah. But these tears were different. These were tears of overwhelming love, of pride, of a heart that had been broken and reformed into something stronger. This little girl, who had been abandoned on a dark highway, who had every reason to give up on the world, was talking about saving others. She had taken her trauma and transformed it into purpose, into hope, into a mission to help. Grace hugged them both, not fully understanding why her daddy was crying, but knowing it was the good kind of crying, the kind that meant something wonderful was happening. The celebration at Chuck E. Cheese afterward was chaotic and perfect. Matthew and Sophie ran from game to game collecting tickets and arguing over which prize to choose. Matthew's parents doted on both their granddaughters. Mrs. Hernandez took approximately 1,000 photos, and Officer Coleman taught the girls how to play skee-ball. As the evening wound down, Sophie climbed up on her chair and clinked her juice box against her plastic cup to get everyone's attention. "I want to say something," she announced with the confidence that had been growing in her over the months. The table went quiet, everyone turning to look at this remarkable little girl. "When I was walking on the road that night, I was so scared. I thought nobody would ever love me again. I thought I was going to die out there and nobody would even know my name." Matthew felt his throat tighten. "But then Daddy found me, and he didn't just drive by like the other cars, he stopped. He gave me his blanket and fixed my feet, and then he kept coming back to the hospital even though he didn't have to." Sophie looked directly at Grace, "And Grace shared her daddy with me even though she didn't have to. She gave me her toys and showed me how to be brave. And now I have a family, a real family, forever." Sophie's voice grew stronger. "Daddy, you didn't just save me that night. You save me every day, every time you pack my lunch with the smiley face note inside, every time you check for monsters under my bed, even though we both know they're not real. Every time you tell me I'm smart and brave and loved, you save me over and over." The restaurant had gone quiet, other families pausing their conversations to listen to this extraordinary little girl. "But I want everyone to know that Daddy thinks he saved me, but he's wrong. He saved all of us. Because I know Grace missed having someone to play dress-up with every day, and I know Daddy was sad sometimes before I came, even though he tried to hide it. And now we're all happy together." She paused, looking around the table at all the faces of people who had become her family. "Daddy always says that families don't happen by accident. They happen because people choose to love each other. And I'm so happy he chose to love me. I'm so happy Grace chose to share. And I promise, when I grow up, I'm going to help other kids who are lost like I was, because that's what heroes do. They save people. And my daddy is the best hero in the world." Matthew stood up and pulled Sophie into his arms, unable to speak through his tears. This child, his child, had somehow found gratitude in abandonment, hope in trauma, purpose in pain. The drive home was quiet, both girls exhausted from the excitement of the day. As Matthew carried a sleeping Sophie to her room, Grace walking beside him with Sophie's adoption day teddy bear, he marveled at how natural it felt. This was his family. This was his life. This was everything he hadn't dared to hope for. As he tucked Sophie into her bed, in her room, in their house, she stirred slightly. "Daddy?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm not lost anymore." The simplicity of the statement hit him like a revelation. "No, baby, you're found. You're home. Forever." Sophie smiled without opening her eyes. "I love you, Daddy."
I love you too, Sophie. More than you'll ever know. Matthew stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching both his daughters sleep peacefully. Grace in her familiar princess bed, surrounded by the stuffed animals that had comforted her through the hardest years of her young life. Sophie in her new bed, finally safe, finally belonging, finally home.
He thought about that night months ago, driving home exhausted from work, focused only on getting back to his one-child life. He could have driven past. He could have assumed someone else would help. He could have convinced himself it wasn't his problem. But he'd stopped, and that single decision had changed 3 lives forever. The next morning brought the usual chaos of getting 2 children ready for school. Sophie still needed extra time with everything. Choosing clothes was overwhelming when you'd spent months with only one outfit, and she sometimes forgot that she didn't have to ask permission for basic things like drinking water or using the bathroom. But she was learning that love could be unconditional, learning that families stayed together even when things got hard, learning that she was worthy of care and attention and patience. At breakfast, Grace was chattering about their upcoming school play, while Sophie carefully arranged her pancakes in a perfect grid, one of the small rituals that helped her feel in control. "Daddy," Grace said suddenly, "can Sophie be in the play too? It's about families, and she's our family now." Sophie looked up hopefully. She'd been enrolled in Grace's school, but was still catching up academically and socially. The idea of being included in something as normal as a school play was both thrilling and terrifying. If Sophie wants to, and if her teacher thinks she's ready. "I want to," Sophie said quietly. "I want to do normal kid things." Normal kid things. Matthew's heart ached at the phrase. At 7 years old, Sophie was having to learn what normal was, having to consciously choose to trust in stability and routine. That afternoon, Matthew got a call at work that made his blood run cold. Sophie's school was on the line. "Mr. Walker, we need you to come pick up Sophie. She's had what we think was a panic attack." Matthew left work immediately, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone said something? Had there been a trigger he hadn't anticipated? He found Sophie in the nurse's office, curled up in a chair that was too big for her face pale and streaked with tears. The nurse's office, Mrs. Kim, looked relieved when he walked in. "Daddy!" Sophie launched herself into his arms, clinging to him like he might disappear. "What happened, sweetheart?" Sophie buried her face in his shoulder. "We were talking about families in class, and Mrs. Rodriguez asked everyone to draw a picture of their family, and I drew you and Grace and me, and Tommy said I was lying because you don't look like my real dad."
Matthew felt anger flash through him, but he kept his voice calm. "What did you say to Tommy?" "I said you are my real dad because you chose me and I chose you. But then he said I was just a foster kid pretending to have a family, and I got scared that maybe it wasn't real. Maybe I was just pretending." Matthew knelt down so he was at Sophie's eye level, his hands on her shoulders. "Sophie, look at me. Do you remember what the judge said in court?" Sophie nodded. "She said you are Sophie Walker. She said, I am your father and Grace is your sister. That's not pretending. That's not temporary. That's forever." "But what if—" "No what ifs," Matthew said firmly but gently. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. You are my daughter. Not my foster daughter, not my adopted daughter, my daughter. Period. Nothing anyone says can change that. Nothing you do can change that. Nothing that happened before can change that." Sophie's breathing began to slow. "Promise?" "I promise. And you know what? Tomorrow, you and Grace and I are going to go to the courthouse and get copies of your adoption papers, and we're going to frame them and hang them in your room so you never, ever have to wonder again." That weekend, they made good on the promise. Sophie's adoption certificate now hung in a frame next to her bed, right beside a photo of their family taken on adoption day. But more importantly, Matthew used the incident as a teaching moment. Sometimes people are going to say hurtful things. They might not understand our family, or they might be dealing with their own problems and take it out on others. But you know what we do when that happens? "Tell them the truth," Grace said confidently. "And what's the truth?" That families are made of love, not just blood, Sophie added, repeating something Matthew had told her during one of their late-night talks. Exactly. And you know what else? Both girls looked at him expectantly. You tell them that Sophie Walker is the bravest, smartest, most loved little girl in Arizona, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with her dad. Sophie giggled, and the sound was like sunshine after rain.
The months that followed brought their own challenges and victories. Sophie's grades improved steadily with tutoring and patience. She made friends at school, slowly learning to trust that relationships could be stable and kind. She joined Grace's soccer team, where she discovered she was fast and fearless, willing to chase down any ball no matter how intimidating the opponent. She still had rough days. Therapy appointments twice a week helped, but healing from abandonment trauma wasn't linear. Some days she was the confident, funny child who fit seamlessly into their family. Other days she was the scared little girl who'd been left on a highway, convinced that love was temporary and everyone would eventually leave. But Matthew had learned to read her moods, to recognize the signs when she was struggling. On those days, he'd pull out the adoption papers and read them to her again, reminding her that legal documents meant forever. On really hard days, he'd tell her the story of the night he found her, how he'd known immediately that she was supposed to be part of their family. "You saved me," he'd always end the story. "But you know what? You saved Grace and me, too, because we were missing someone, and we just didn't know it yet." The first time Sophie called him Dad instead of Daddy Matthew was at a parent-teacher conference 6 months after the adoption. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, the same one who'd innocently triggered Sophie's panic attack, was praising Sophie's progress. "She's really blossomed," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Her writing has improved dramatically, and she's become one of our most empathetic students. She has a special way with the other children who are struggling." "That's my dad," Sophie said proudly, beaming at Matthew. "He taught me that everyone deserves kindness." Dad. Not Daddy Matthew, not foster dad, not even adopted dad, just Dad. Matthew had to excuse himself to the hallway for a moment to collect himself. When he returned, Sophie was showing Mrs. Rodriguez the charm bracelet Grace had made for her, explaining each charm's significance: a heart for love, a house for home, a star for wishes coming true. "This one's my favorite," Sophie said, pointing to a small angel charm. "It's for my first mommy watching over me from heaven. And this one," she pointed to a small truck, "is for the night Daddy found me."
Matthew watched his daughter, explain her life story with a confidence and peace that would have seemed impossible 8 months ago. She'd transformed her trauma into strength, her abandonment into appreciation, her fear into hope. That night, as he tucked both girls into bed, Matthew reflected on how completely his life had changed. The quiet house that had once felt too empty now buzzed with constant activity. The spare room that had been a shrine to unfulfilled dreams was now a little girl's bedroom, complete with fairy lights and a growing collection of books. His heart, which had been carefully guarded and slowly healing, had been blown wide open by a child who needed saving and ended up saving him instead. "Daddy," Sophie said as he kissed her goodnight, "I'm writing a story for school about heroes." "What kind of heroes?" "The kind who stop when everyone else drives by. The kind who see someone who needs help and don't think about how hard it might be. They just help." Matthew sat on the edge of her bed. "Sounds like a good story." "It is. It's about you, and it's about me too, because Mrs. Rodriguez said I'm a hero for being brave and helping other kids who are sad or scared." "You are brave, Sophie. The bravest person I know." Sophie smiled sleepily. "I know. You taught me that brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and choosing to be kind anyway." As Matthew turned off her lamp and headed for the door, Sophie's voice stopped him one more time. "Daddy, I'm glad Mommy left me on that road." The words were like a punch to the chest.
Sophie. Not because she left me, Sophie clarified quickly. That was scary and sad. But because, if she hadn't, I never would have found you and Grace. I never would have known what it feels like to be someone's everything. Matthew's eyes filled with tears. You are our everything, sweetheart. I know, and you're mine. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you of the power we all have to change someone's life with a simple act of kindness, please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our Everbells Stories family.